Ladies and gentlemen, I want to share a truth that most people completely miss when it comes to relationships, and it's one of the most powerful insights you can ever have. You see, there's a type of person we call the avoidant. They pull away, they retreat, they make you feel like you're chasing a ghost. And for the longest time, it feels like you're doing something wrong. But here's the truth. Avoidants only crumble when you finally understand one simple thing: it's not about you. It's about them. Their fear, their need for space, their patterns that they can't control. And here's where most people fail. They react. They beg, they chase, they try to fix it. And every time they do, the avoidant feels validated in their behavior. Now, imagine flipping the script. Imagine reclaiming your energy, standing in your truth, knowing that your worth, your love, your life is not dependent on their approval. The moment you stop chasing, the moment you stop trying to bend yourself to their rhythm, that's the moment the dynamic shifts. Avoidants crumble when they meet someone who doesn't react out of fear or neediness, someone who has boundaries, self-respect, and emotional independence, because now they are confronted with a mirror. They see that you are unshakable, that you are not a project, that you cannot be pulled into their emotional games. And here's the most powerful part. You don't need to change them. You don't need to make them love you. All you need to do is stand firm in your value. Your calm, confident, and self-assured presence does the work for you. The avoidant crumbles, not because you chased harder, but because you stopped. Let's dive deep into the first idea, because this is the foundation of everything you need to understand about avoidant behavior. When we talk about avoidant individuals, it's important to realize that their actions are not random or purely cruel. They're rooted in fear, in a deep-seated discomfort with vulnerability. You see, avoidants are not people who lack emotions or the capacity to care. On the contrary, many of them feel intensely. But there's a part of themselves they are terrified to reveal, a part that feels exposed when they allow someone in. This fear doesn't always look dramatic. Often, it manifests as subtle distancing, pulling away at moments when intimacy or closeness is increasing, or creating distractions and excuses to avoid confronting emotional depth. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidance is that they are cold or uncaring. That couldn't be further from the truth. They care deeply, but caring makes them uncomfortable, because intimacy requires surrendering control, and avoidants are wired to protect themselves from being hurt. Their avoidance is like a shield. They hold it up preemptively to prevent perceived rejection or emotional overwhelm. The problem is that, from the outside, it can feel like rejection of you personally, and that's where many people stumble. They interpret these distancing behaviors as disinterest or lack of love, when in fact, it's a protective mechanism. Think of it like this: an avoidant individual's emotional world is like a room with a very fragile vase inside. They are terrified that if anyone touches it, it will shatter. So instead of trusting that someone can handle their emotions, they keep the door half closed, letting just enough light in to survive, but never enough to truly connect. And when someone who genuinely cares pushes to open the door, their instinct is to pull back, to protect the fragility they feel inside. Understanding this is critical, because once you recognize that their distance is about their fear, not your inadequacy, the game changes. It's no longer about chasing or trying to fix them. It's about observing, understanding, and responding strategically. Another thing to note is that avoidants often struggle to identify and articulate their own needs. Their fear of closeness means they've learned to cope by suppressing desires, emotions, and vulnerabilities. They might not even realize that their behaviors, like disappearing for days, avoiding serious conversations, or resisting emotional intimacy, are hurting the people around them. Their world is guided by avoidance, not malice. So, when you interact with someone avoidant, patience and clarity become your allies. You start to see patterns emerge, small signs that reveal their discomfort before it escalates into distancing. You begin to understand that when they push away, it's not personal, it's internal. This awareness gives you power. Once you understand that their avoidance is fear-driven, your approach changes. You stop reacting impulsively or feeling personally rejected, and instead, you maintain your composure, your confidence, and your emotional autonomy. You realize that their behavior is a reflection of their inner world, not your worth. And paradoxically, when you stop trying to solve their fear and instead stand firm in your own stability, that's when the dynamic shifts. Avoidants are drawn to emotional strength. They recognize it, even if they initially resist it. They can sense when someone is operating from fear versus self-assuredness, and the latter makes them confront what they've been avoiding, their own capacity for closeness. The key takeaway here is this: understanding avoidant behavior requires empathy paired with discernment. It's not about excusing their actions or tolerating repeated hurt, but about recognizing the origin of those actions. When you see that avoidance stems from fear and not a lack of care, you step out of the cycle of frustration, confusion, and emotional turmoil. You begin to interact with clarity and calm, noticing the subtle signals, rather than reacting emotionally. And this is the first step in transforming not only your relationship with avoidance, but your own sense of emotional power and freedom. Once you grasp the nature of avoidant behavior, the next layer of understanding is the immense power of emotional independence. Emotional independence is not about shutting people out or refusing to care. It's about cultivating a strong, grounded sense of self that does not rely on another person for validation, reassurance, or happiness. This is especially crucial when dealing with avoidant individuals, because they are experts at testing your stability, often unintentionally, simply by the way they guard themselves. If your sense of self wavers depending on their attention, affection, or availability, you hand them control over your emotional state, and that's where the imbalance begins. The truth is, avoidants are naturally drawn to people who demonstrate self-sufficiency. It's not arrogance, it's an unspoken signal that you are secure, capable, and not desperate to fill an emotional void. Desperation triggers avoidance instinctively because it magnifies the pressure and threat of closeness. Conversely, when you operate from emotional independence, you create a magnetic dynamic. You show that your world does not revolve entirely around them, yet you are still open, compassionate, and engaging. You maintain interest without neediness, connection without codependency, and boundaries without rigidity. This balance is disarming for someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding emotional exposure. Emotional independence begins with clarity about your own worth and the recognition that your happiness is your responsibility. Many people fall into the trap of thinking that love or validation from another person can complete them. With avoidance, this becomes particularly dangerous because their avoidance triggers insecurity in those who depend on external reassurance. When you internalize your self-worth, however, you stop reacting to their distancing behaviors with panic or anxiety. You no longer chase, plead, or overcompensate. Instead, you observe, respond deliberately, and maintain your own emotional equilibrium. This shift is subtle but profoundly transformative. Another critical aspect of emotional independence is developing resilience to uncertainty. Avoidants often send mixed signals. They may pull away one moment, return the next, or oscillate between warmth and distance. If your emotional state is tied to these fluctuations, you will feel constantly destabilized. Emotional independence allows you to navigate this uncertainty with calm and perspective. You understand that their behavior is about them, not a reflection of your value, and you cultivate patience without sacrificing your self-respect. You learn to engage fully in the present moment without being hostage to their patterns. It's also essential to recognize that emotional independence is about creating an internal compass. Instead of looking outward for validation, attention, or proof of affection, you learn to validate yourself. You celebrate your wins, nurture your passions, and maintain a life full of meaning and purpose regardless of the avoidance participation. This doesn't mean detachment from the relationship, it means presence without dependence. The paradox is that by stepping into this space of self-sufficiency, avoidants often become more available, not because you forced them, but because they sense you are not desperate, and they no longer feel the pressure to retreat. Emotional independence requires practice and self-awareness. You need to notice when old patterns of neediness creep in, like seeking constant reassurance, overanalyzing texts, or interpreting distance as rejection. Each time you pause, breathe, and reaffirm your self-worth, you strengthen your emotional foundation. Over time, this foundation becomes unshakable. You no longer collapse under their distance or pull back in fear of closeness. Instead, you remain composed, confident, and centered. Ultimately, the power of emotional independence is that it transforms the dynamic entirely. Avoidants who thrive on distance find themselves drawn in because your stability highlights the contrast between their fear and your strength. They are compelled to confront the very walls they have been hiding behind because they cannot manipulate or unsettle someone who stands firm in self-respect. Emotional independence does not manipulate, control, or chase. It simply radiates strength and clarity, and that, paradoxically, is when avoidants begin to crumble, not because you tried to change them, but because you refused to let their avoidance define your emotional reality. Once you've understood avoidant behavior and embraced emotional independence, the next critical layer is the role of boundaries. Boundaries are not walls, they are the framework that allows you to engage with others, especially avoidants, without losing yourself. Many people misunderstand boundaries as coldness or rigidity, but in reality, they are an expression of self-respect and clarity. Avoidants are particularly sensitive to boundaries because their natural instinct is to maintain control over their emotional space. When you establish firm, consistent boundaries, you signal that you are in charge of your life and emotions, and this alone shifts the dynamic in profound ways. The first step in setting boundaries is defining your limits clearly. This means understanding what behaviors you will accept and what you will not tolerate, and being unapologetic about those decisions. For instance, if an avoidant consistently disappears for days without explanation, and it triggers anxiety for you, a boundary might look like, I respect your need for space, but I need consistent communication to feel secure. Establishing this doesn't mean demanding control over them, it means asserting control over yourself. By doing so, you create a safe environment for both parties, you protect your emotional well-being, and they are confronted with the reality that avoidance has consequences. Boundaries also serve as a mirror for avoidance. Many avoidants have spent years operating in a world where people accommodate their distancing tendencies, effectively allowing their fear to dictate the pace and depth of connection. When you implement boundaries, it challenges their pattern in a subtle but powerful way. They begin to see that their avoidance is no longer shaping your emotional state or dictating your actions. This can be unsettling for them because it exposes a truth. They've been avoiding meaningful relationships require engagement, consistency, and accountability. Boundaries force avoidance to confront this without you needing to argue, chase, or plead. Another essential component of boundaries is consistency. Avoidants are quick to notice inconsistency because it often signals insecurity or desperation. If you declare a boundary but falter under pressure, the dynamic remains the same. They continue to test limits and maintain control. Consistency shows that your boundaries are non-negotiable, and it communicates strength and self-respect. This doesn't make you unyielding or unloving. It makes you reliable, predictable, and grounded. You are demonstrating that your emotional stability is yours to manage, not theirs to disrupt. Boundaries also create space for mutual respect. When avoidants sense that you are clear about your limits and will not compromise your self-respect, they are compelled to adjust their behavior if they want the relationship to thrive. This adjustment is rarely instant, but it is inevitable. The very act of standing firm exposes the avoidance patterns and makes it difficult for them to continue operating from fear without noticing the impact of their actions. You are essentially holding up a mirror, showing them how avoidance affects connection while simultaneously protecting your own energy. Importantly, boundaries are not just about protecting yourself. They are about fostering healthier interactions. They communicate that closeness is welcomed, but only on terms that respect both parties' needs. Avoidants respond to this clarity because it removes ambiguity. Ambiguity creates anxiety, and avoidants often retreat when they feel emotionally pressured or confused. Boundaries eliminate the uncertainty, allowing them to engage more authentically, even if gradually. Finally, boundaries empower you to act from choice rather than reaction. Instead of chasing, pleading, or compromising your values to keep an avoidant close, you operate from a position of deliberate intent. You can show care and affection without sacrificing your self-respect. This shift is profoundly attractive to avoidants because it challenges their assumptions. Someone can be fully themselves, emotionally grounded, and still demand respect. Over time, this is the very mechanism that begins to crumble the walls they have built, not by force, but by unwavering clarity, firmness, and integrity. Now that we've explored avoidant behavior, emotional independence, and the power of boundaries, it's crucial to confront a common trap that many people fall into: chasing. Chasing is instinctual when we care deeply about someone, but when it comes to avoidance, it often backfires in ways that are both frustrating and exhausting. Avoidants are wired to pull away from intensity, neediness, or any pressure that threatens their sense of autonomy. When we chase, we inadvertently reinforce the very behavior we wish to change, because it validates their fear and gives them control over the pace of the relationship. Understanding this is vital, because once you grasp it, you stop wasting energy on patterns that keep you stuck. Chasing often takes the form of over-communication, seeking constant reassurance, or trying to force emotional connection when the other person is pulling back. Many people interpret avoidance as a lack of love or commitment, and so they respond by investing more time, energy, and emotion to fix the situation. But here's the paradox: the harder you chase, the more avoidants feel the need to retreat. Their nervous system interprets pressure as a threat, which triggers their protective instincts. They are not rejecting you personally, they are responding to their own fear of vulnerability. The chasing, however well-intentioned, amplifies their avoidance and keeps you emotionally reactive instead of grounded. The truth about chasing is that it rarely creates closeness and often erodes self-respect. When you find yourself constantly reaching out, overanalyzing messages, or feeling anxious about their distance, your emotional energy is no longer yours. It's being consumed by their avoidance. This creates an unbalanced dynamic where your sense of worth becomes intertwined with their responsiveness. Avoidants, on the other hand, remain emotionally self-contained, often unaware of the impact their behavior has on you. This dynamic fosters frustration, confusion, and resentment over time, and it can make you question your value when in reality, the problem lies in the interaction pattern, not your worth. Instead of chasing, the key is to shift your energy toward presence and self-assurance. Respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. Give space when space is needed, and engage when connection is mutually available. By stepping out of the cycle of chasing, you reclaim your emotional authority. You begin to operate from choice rather than compulsion, which changes the energetic dynamic entirely. Avoidants are deeply attuned to confidence and self-reliance. When you stop chasing and instead focus on your own growth, purpose, and fulfillment, they notice the shift. Suddenly, they are confronted with someone who is stable, attractive, and whole, someone who is no longer dependent on their approval or attention. It's also important to understand that stopping the chase does not mean detachment or indifference. It means choosing not to compromise your integrity or self-worth for someone else's fear. You can still show care, set intentions, and express interest, but you do so from a grounded place. This creates a sense of mystery and autonomy that naturally draws avoidants closer. They may initially resist because it challenges their established pattern of control, but over time, they are compelled to engage differently because the old dynamic no longer works. Chasing is the old script, emotional independence and presence is the new script, and it changes the rules of the interaction. Another layer to consider is patience. Avoidants often need time to feel safe enough to lower their walls, and rushing or pressuring them only triggers more withdrawal. By stepping back from chasing, you give them the space to approach on their own terms. Yet, crucially, your patience is anchored in self-respect, not anxiety or fear. This subtle but profound difference is what shifts the balance. Avoidants may resist initially, but when they sense that you are not desperate, not reactive, and fully in command of your emotional world, their defensive patterns begin to lose power. The lesson is this: chasing never forces connection, it only reinforces avoidance. Stepping back, reclaiming your emotional power, and approaching interactions from a place of choice and confidence is what changes the dynamic. Avoidants crumble not because they are forced, but because they encounter someone who refuses to be destabilized by their fear. A person who understands that true connection cannot be coerced, only invited through strength, clarity, and presence. Once you understand the futility of chasing, the next critical insight is the transformative power of attracting through self-worth. This is where the dynamic with avoidance shifts in a way that feels almost magical. But it isn't magic, it's strategy grounded in emotional truth. Self-worth is not arrogance or entitlement, it's the quiet, unwavering belief that you are enough, independent of anyone else's validation. When you operate from this place, you radiate a sense of confidence that avoidants, who instinctively resist neediness and emotional dependence, cannot ignore. They are drawn to it precisely because it challenges the patterns they've relied on for so long. To attract through self-worth, the first step is cultivating an internal sense of value. This means acknowledging your strengths, your passions, your desires, and your boundaries. You recognize that you deserve respect, consistency, and emotional reciprocity, and you refuse to compromise these principles for temporary approval or fleeting attention. When avoidants sense that you are grounded in this way, your energy communicates something far more compelling than words ever could. You are whole, you are confident, and you will not settle for anything less than what aligns with your value. This alone changes the dynamic dramatically. Another critical element is detachment from outcome. Avoidants are experts at triggering anxiety because they often behave unpredictably, pulling away, giving inconsistent attention, or signaling interest and then retreating. If your sense of worth depends on their responses, you are at their mercy. But when you cultivate self-worth, your focus shifts from controlling their behavior to maintaining your own integrity and emotional stability. You engage with intention, not desperation. You interact because you choose to, not because you fear losing them. This distinction creates a magnetic pull that is subtle yet irresistible. Avoidants recognize when someone is secure, and security is one of the most attractive qualities to someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding vulnerability. Self-worth also manifests through visible confidence in your life outside the relationship. Pursuing goals, nurturing friendships, investing in your interests, and maintaining emotional resilience signals to avoidants that your world does not revolve around them. They cannot pull you into a cycle of chasing or insecurity because your sense of fulfillment is independent of their participation. This independence is disarming. It forces avoidants to confront their patterns in a new way. When they see someone fully engaged in life, unafraid of their walls, it naturally draws them closer. They sense authenticity, strength, and a challenge that is not threatening, but deeply compelling. Equally important is the balance of openness and self-protection. Attracting through self-worth does not mean shutting down or becoming emotionally unavailable. It means engaging from a place of choice, where your presence is generous but not dependent on reciprocation. Avoidants respond to this balance because it mirrors the security they often crave, but cannot articulate. They are drawn to someone who can love freely without losing themselves, who can set boundaries without alienating, and who can offer connection without demanding control. Over time, consistently operating from self-worth transforms the dynamic entirely. Avoidants who may have been resistant, distant, or unpredictable begin to notice the difference between someone reactive and someone grounded. They are compelled to confront their avoidance because your energy no longer tolerates manipulation, inconsistency, or emotional games. Your self-respect becomes the standard by which they measure connection, not your anxiety, neediness, or attempts to fix them. Attracting through self-worth is about embodying a level of confidence that requires no external validation. It is about living fully, valuing yourself, and engaging with others from strength rather than need. Avoidants crumble not because you force them to feel or change, but because your self-assured energy exposes the limitations of their avoidance. They are drawn to connection on your terms, not theirs, and it is precisely this energy, rooted in unwavering self-worth, that begins to dissolve the walls they have built for so long. Now we arrive at the final, and perhaps most illuminating point, the moment avoidants crumble. This is not a dramatic collapse or an overnight transformation. It is subtle, inevitable, and rooted in the consistent energy you bring to the relationship. Avoidants build walls as a defense mechanism, a way to protect themselves from vulnerability, rejection, or emotional overwhelm. But walls, no matter how tall, are not impenetrable. They are designed to repel neediness and insecurity, but they cannot withstand unwavering self respect, emotional independence, and consistent boundaries. The moment they begin to crumble is not about forcing them to change. It is about embodying a presence that challenges their avoidance without aggression, without pleading, and without compromise. This moment often begins quietly. Avoidants start to notice a shift in your behavior. You are no longer reactive to their pullbacks. You do not chase, overanalyze, or overextend yourself in search of reassurance. Your energy is calm, confident, and grounded. You maintain your boundaries consistently, pursue your passions, and operate from a place of choice rather than fear. This stability creates tension in their system, not because you are controlling them, but because the old patterns they relied on are no longer effective. Their avoidance can no longer manipulate or destabilize you, and for someone who has spent so much of their life avoiding closeness, this realization is profound and disarming. Avoidants often crumble when they see that connection is still possible without pressure or compromise. They realize that their walls are no longer serving them the same way. They cannot hide behind fear to control the pace of the relationship because you have refused to let your emotional state be dictated by them. This is where the magic of your presence comes into play. You demonstrate, day after day, that intimacy does not have to feel like a threat, that connection can exist alongside autonomy, and that boundaries and self-worth are not barriers, but bridges to genuine closeness. This realization is often uncomfortable for avoidants because it exposes a vulnerability they have spent years denying. The process of crumbling is also psychological. Avoidants are forced to confront their own patterns when they encounter someone who refuses to participate in the push and pull dynamic. They notice that your calm, consistent energy contrasts sharply with their habitual cycles of retreat and approach. Over time, they begin to question their own behaviors, not because you told them to, but because the contrast makes it impossible to ignore. They see someone who is fully present, fully grounded, and fully themselves, and they recognize the gap between that energy and their own avoidance. This recognition is the beginning of internal change, the subtle softening of walls that were once thought impenetrable. Another key element is the interplay of desire and respect. Avoidants are drawn to strength and stability, and when they witness someone who embodies these qualities, their natural curiosity and desire for connection are awakened. They start to engage more consistently, show vulnerability in measured ways, and explore emotional intimacy at a pace that aligns with respect rather than fear. The crumble is not a surrender to pressure, but an organic response to seeing someone operate from integrity and self-assurance. In other words, it's your energy that creates the conditions for transformation, not coercion or manipulation. Finally, the moment avoidants crumble is also liberating for you. It validates the power of emotional independence, boundaries, and self-worth. You realize that connection does not require chasing, begging, or compromising your value. By holding your ground, you create a space where authentic intimacy can emerge. Avoidants are forced to reckon with the fact that their avoidance can no longer dictate the emotional terms of the relationship. And in this confrontation, real change begins. The walls that once seemed immovable start to shift, not because of force, but because they recognize strength, clarity, and unwavering presence. This moment, subtle yet transformative, is the culmination of all the previous steps: understanding their behavior, cultivating emotional independence, setting boundaries, ceasing to chase, and radiating self-worth. When these elements align, avoidants are confronted with the truth. They have long resisted meaningful connection is possible, but only when approached with strength, clarity, and integrity. And it is precisely in this alignment that their defenses begin to crumble, paving the way for authentic, lasting connection. In the end, the journey with avoidance is never about forcing change or trying to fix someone else's fears. It is about understanding, self-mastery, and unwavering clarity. When you recognize their patterns, cultivate emotional independence, establish firm boundaries, step back from chasing, and radiate self-worth, you do more than navigate avoidance. You transform the dynamic entirely. Avoidants crumble not because of pressure or persuasion, but because they encounter someone who stands grounded, confident, and whole. And that is the ultimate truth. Strength, self-respect, and clarity are far more magnetic than desperation ever could be. When you embody these qualities, Connection no longer feels like a battle. It becomes a natural, inevitable, and profoundly empowering experience. Tankyo Yu.